Want to tell you something before we get into this. Most people hear Cowboy meets Apache woman and they already think they know the story. They've seen the painting. They've watched the movie. They know how it ends before the first page turns. This isn't that story. This is about a man who spent 40 years learning how to keep his mouth shut and his opinions to himself. And one afternoon in a canyon kitchen that undid all of it in about 20 minutes flat. It's about a woman who had been feeding people her whole life and never once been asked what she wanted to eat. And it's about a promise made at a wooden table with cracked hands and a full stomach, the kind of promise that doesn't come with a ring or a witness or a ceremony, the kind that just sits inside you, quiet and heavy and permanent. I know because I was there. I saw his face when he tasted that food. I've seen men cry at funerals. I've seen them cry when their horses went lame. I've seen Hector Brannigan cry exactly once in the 31 years I've known him, and it wasn't at his mother's burial, like you might expect. It was over a bowl of blue corn mush and dried venison stew, in a one-room dwelling that smelled of cedar smoke and something I still can't name. You'll understand by the end. Or maybe you won't completely, and that's all right too. Some things are bigger than understanding. I keep a ledger. Not for money, though there's one of those too, thin as it is. This one's personal. Leather-bound, small enough to fit in my breast pocket, and I've carried it since I was 19 years old, and my father told me I had a bad memory and worse judgment, and that I ought to write things down before I forgot them entirely. He wasn't wrong about either. I write things I see, things I hear that strike me as worth keeping, dates mostly, small incidents, the way the light hit something strange, the exact words someone said that lodged in my chest like a splinter and wouldn't work their way out. My name is Dahlen Reeves. I'm a ranch hand, third year working Brannigan spread outside of Morales, New Mexico territory, and I have spent the better part of those 3 years watching Hector Brannigan do things that end up in my ledger more often than any other man I've known. October 14, 1883. Hector argued with a fence post for 20 minutes. The post held firm. Hector did not. March 2, 1884. Hector gave his last biscuit to a stray dog, then pretended he hadn't wanted it anyway. June 7, 1884. Hector rode 11 miles in the dark to return a bridle that wasn't his, said he didn't need it on his conscience. That's the kind of man he is. Not gentle, exactly. Not soft. But something that runs underneath those things, something stubborn and deep, like an underground river you can't see but can feel pushing up through the rock when you press your hand flat to the ground. He was 53 years old that summer. Weathered in the way that desert men get weathered, not aged exactly, just compressed, like the heat and wind had pressed everything unnecessary out of him, until only the essential things remained. His hands were the size of small shovels. He had a scar running diagonally across his left forearm from a wire fence incident he refused to elaborate on. He kept his opinions close, and his silences long, and most people around Morales either admired him for it or found it unsettling, depending on their temperament. I was one of the admiring ones, I'll say that plainly. The summer it happened, the summer of Natty's cooking and the promise, had started badly in the way that summers in the territory sometimes did. Dry, mean, and getting worse. We'd lost 2 head of cattle to a cougar that the other hand swore was supernatural in size. The well on the east pasture had gone brackish, and there'd been a land dispute simmering with a rancher named Pollitt 3 miles west that nobody wanted to boil over, but everyone could feel building like a thunderhead. Hector took all of this with his customary silence. You'd watch his jaw work like he was chewing something he didn't like the taste of, and then he'd just absorb it, file it somewhere inside himself and move on. It was the drought that finally sent him east, toward the canyon country. We needed water access. A seasonal creek that cut through the canyon land still ran clean that time of year, and Hector wanted to scout whether we could run a line from it to the east pasture before the heat peaked. He took me with him because I was the only hand who'd been that far east before, and also because, I think, he didn't entirely trust himself not to make a wrong turn without someone to check him. We rode out on a Tuesday morning before first light. The canyon country is different from the open range in ways that are hard to explain to someone who hasn't been in both. On the range, you feel exposed. The sky presses down on you from every direction, and you're just a small dark shape under all that blue. In the canyons, it's the opposite. The walls rise up around you, red and gold and ancient, and you start to feel held, like the land has arms. I wrote that down, actually. The land here has arms. We found the creek by midday. It was still running, not strong but present, which was more than I'd hoped for. Hector knelt beside it and put his hand in the water and stayed like that for almost a full minute, just feeling the current, his face doing something private that I looked away from. It was on the ride back, cutting through a narrow pass between two canyon walls, that we smelled the smoke. Cook fire, with smoke and something else, meat, maybe, and something herbal I couldn't place. My horse threw her head up. Hector's hand went to his rifle, a reflex, just muscle memory from too many years. But then he stopped, and dropped it back and sat very still. "Apache camp," he said quietly, not alarmed, just stating it. I knew there were families in this canyon country. Everyone knew. The territory had been reshaping itself violently for years, and some families had stayed close to the land they knew while everything reorganized itself around them. You didn't always see them, but you knew. What happened next, what Hector did, is the thing that required its own page in my ledger. He didn't turn around. He sat there on his horse, head tilted slightly, and he said, "I'm going to see if they need anything." I stared at him. "Hector, you can wait here if you'd rather." He said it without implication, just factual, the way he said most things. He was already moving. I followed, of course I followed. The camp was small, a single dwelling built into a rock shelf, sheltered from the worst of the wind. A garden plot, surprisingly large, carved out of what seemed like impossibly hard ground. A fire outside with a clay pot hanging over it, and beside that fire a woman. She was older, not ancient but marked, the way people get marked when they've carried something heavy for a long time and the carrying shows in how they hold themselves. Her hair was dark, threaded with silver, pulled back simply. She wore a cotton dress, worn but clean, and she was stirring something in the pot with a long wooden implement. And she did not look up when we approached, even though she had certainly heard us from 100 yards. That was a choice, I noted, not obliviousness, deliberateness. Hector stopped his horse at what felt like the appropriate distance, close enough to be seen clearly, far enough to announce no threat, and he took his hat off. I want you to understand that I had never in 3 years seen Hector Brannigan take his hat off for anything except sleep and church. And he didn't much go to church. "Morning," he said, and then because he was Hector, that was it, just the one word. The woman stirred her pot twice around, then she looked up. Her eyes were dark and measuring, and they moved from Hector to me and back to Hector with a precision that made me feel briefly transparent, like she was reading something written on the inside of us. She said something I didn't understand. The language was musical and quick, and she said it with a tone that wasn't hostile but wasn't welcoming either. It was evaluating. A question of some kind. Hector's jaw worked. Then he reached into his saddlebag and drew out the only thing in there worth offering. 2 biscuits, wrapped in a cloth, that had been our lunch. He held them out. The woman looked at the biscuits. She looked at Hector. She set down her stirring implement with care, not rushing, not performing, just moving at her own pace, and she walked to him and took the biscuits. She unwrapped the cloth, looked at them, and then looked up at Hector with an expression that I wrote down that evening because I knew I'd lose it otherwise. Like she was deciding something. Like the biscuits weren't the point and she knew it and wanted to see if he knew it too. She said something else, shorter this time. Then she turned and walked back toward her fire, and she gestured, once briefly, without looking back at the ground beside it. Hector dismounted. He tied his horse, and he sat down cross-legged on the ground beside a woman whose name he didn't know, in a canyon he'd only half explored, and he waited to see what she was cooking. I wrote in my ledger that evening, October 14th, 1884, Hector sat down. That's the whole entry. I don't know why it felt important enough to write. I still don't entirely, but it did. Her name we learned over the following hour through a halting, gesture-heavy, occasionally absurd exchange that involved Hector pointing at things, and the woman correcting his pronunciation with the flat patience of someone who has explained things many times. Her name was Natty. That was what she allowed us to call her anyway. Whether it was her full name, I never knew. She had a daughter somewhere. That much came through. A gesture toward the canyon's deeper passage, a word repeated twice. Gone, maybe, or away. The grammar of the gesture was ambiguous and neither of us pressed. She lived alone. She cooked like it was a serious matter, not joylessly, but with the attention a craftsman gives their work. The pot contained something I couldn't identify by sight. A thick stew, dark and fragrant, with what I eventually understood to be dried venison, and something made from blue corn, and herbs that she'd kept in small tied bundles hanging from a shelf carved into the rock wall of her dwelling. She ladled some into a clay bowl. She handed it to Hector. He took it with both hands that mattered. He'd noticed her holding things with both hands and he was paying attention. And he looked at it, and then he looked at her, and she made a small gesture with her chin that clearly meant go ahead then. He ate. I need to tell you about Hector Brannigan's face, right then, because I don't think I can explain the rest of it without this part. He was not a man who showed things on his face. 31 years I've said this, and I'd seen the full range of him. Anger, grief, exhaustion, satisfaction. He had one expression for all of them, a kind of controlled stillness, like a pond's surface with whatever was happening underneath kept well below the visible. When he tasted Natty's stew, something moved across his face that I had no name for. It wasn't just satisfaction. It wasn't just surprise, though there was that. It was, and I'm going to write this knowing it sounds overworked. Knowing it sounds like something a person says when they're reaching for language that doesn't quite fit. It was recognition. Like he'd tasted something that reminded him of a thing he hadn't known he'd forgotten. He ate slowly. He didn't speak. Natty sat across from him and watched the fire and didn't ask him anything, which I think was itself a kind of courtesy, giving a man space to have his experience without having to narrate it. He finished. He held the empty bowl in both hands for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "What's in it?" Natty looked at him. The question was impossible, obviously. The language gap was enormous. But she seemed to understand the spirit of it anyway because she stood and moved to her hanging bundles and one by one she touched them. This one, that one, this one. Not explaining, just showing. These are mine. This is what I know. This is where it comes from. Hector watched each one. He nodded at each one. Then he looked at her, and he said something I wrote down word for word because the moment demanded it. "You've been cooking like this for a long time." Not a question, just a statement, an acknowledgement of a thing that was plainly true and that, for whatever reason, seemed important to say out loud. Natty looked at him. Something moved in her face that I won't try to name because I don't think I have the right. And that was the end of part 1. Or the beginning of it, depending on how you want to count. We rode back to the ranch in the early dark, and Hector didn't say a word the whole way. That wasn't unusual. Hector's silences were load-bearing, they held things up. You learn not to push on them. But this one felt different. Heavier, maybe, or more occupied. Like there was more going on inside it than was typical even for him. I wrote in my ledger by firelight that night. He's thinking about something he doesn't have language for yet. I know the look. I did know the look. I'd seen it before, on men who'd had an experience that rearranged something inside them and were still trying to figure out what had moved and where it had gone. 3 days later, Hector told me we were going back. I said, to the canyon. He said, yes. I said, to Nat's camp. He said, yes. I waited for more. There wasn't more. I packed 2 days of provisions, including some extra coffee and a bolt of plain blue cloth that Hector had bought from the supply wagon without comment, and we rode east again in the early morning, while the sky was still more dark than light, and the coyotes were still talking in the middle distance. Natty was in her garden when we arrived. She looked up when she heard the horses, and she watched us approach with that same measuring stillness. She'd had the first time not alarm, not welcome, just assessment. She had a digging implement in her hand, and there was soil on both forearms, and she looked, somehow, entirely at home in the world in a way that I found quietly devastating. Hector dismounted, hat off again. He held out the bolt of cloth. Natty looked at it for a long moment. Then she set down her digging tool and wiped her hands on her dress and came forward and took it, and she examined it with her hands, running her fingers across the weave, and something passed briefly across her face that I decided was approval. She said something, brief, turned and went into her dwelling and came back a moment later without the cloth and with a small clay cup, which she handed to Hector. He took it, looked inside, looked at her, drank. Whatever it wasn't coffee. His eyes went wide for a moment, just briefly, and then settled, and he nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. That was how the second visit began. Over the course of that afternoon, something shifted in the dynamic of our three-way communication, a thaw, maybe, or an adjustment of terms. Natty began to speak more, not to us exactly, but at the situation in her own language, with occasional glances that told you she knew perfectly well we couldn't follow and didn't particularly care. She wasn't performing for us. She was just present. Fully present, in the way that people sometimes are when they've stopped accommodating what other people need them to be. I found a word for it eventually, unsuppressed. She was entirely unsuppressed. Hector watched her the way I've seen him watch things that interested him. Crows, unusual cloud formations, the way water moves around an obstacle in a stream. Focused, patient, without agenda. She cooked again. Not the same stew, something different, dried corn cakes cooked directly on a flat stone at the fire's edge, with a paste made from something red and fragrant that she ground between 2 stones with a motion so practiced it looked almost meditative. She cooked without fuss, without showmanship, without the self-consciousness that people sometimes have when they know they're being observed. When they were ready, she handed one to me and one to Hector and kept one herself. We ate. I want to stop here and say something about food, because I think it's important to the rest of this, and I don't want it to get lost. There is a category of food that exists beyond hunger, beyond nutrition, beyond flavor even. It's the kind of food that carries context, history, practice, care, the accumulated knowledge of 100 hands that cooked this thing before the person cooking it now. You can taste the lineage in it. You can taste the intent. Natty's cooking was that kind. Every time she prepared something, you felt like you were receiving a thing that had been handed down through generations of careful attention. It wasn't just that the food was good, though it was extraordinary. It was that the food meant something. It was language. It was memory. It was argument against everything that had tried to erase it. I don't know if Hector articulated it to himself that way. He wasn't a man for elaborate frameworks, but I think he felt it. I think it hit him somewhere below the level of words, which is maybe why words were slow to come for him in those weeks. Because there were more visits, that's the thing I should tell you. It became, quietly and without any formal declaration, a thing that happened. Every week, sometimes twice, we'd ride out to the canyon. Hector would bring something: cloth, once a small tool he'd repaired, once seeds from the ranch vegetable garden with some half-pantomimed instruction about planting depth that made Natty look at him with an expression that was probably amusement. She'd cook. We'd eat. We'd communicate in the limited, inexact, occasionally absurd way that was possible between us. And slowly, something built. Not romance. I want to be careful here, because the story isn't that, and reducing it to that would be a kind of dishonesty. What built was something else. Something more difficult to name and maybe more durable. Regard. The kind that develops between people who have seen each other clearly and chosen to continue showing up anyway. Natty began teaching Hector things. It started with plants. She'd take him to the canyon wall or the garden edge, and she'd point at something and say its name, and then indicate what it did: this one for headache, this one for stomach trouble, this one you dry and the smell keeps insects away. Hector listened to all of it with total attention, and he began to keep his own notes, small cramped writing on the back pages of his work ledger. He never said a word about this at the ranch. The other hands didn't know where he went on those mornings. I kept his confidence, obviously. The moment that changed things, the one that moved everything forward into harder territory, came on a visit in late August. Natty was quieter than usual. That was the first thing. Not closed exactly, but contained. Her movements at the fire were slower. She ate almost nothing from her own bowl. When she looked into the middle distance, which she did more than usual, her face was doing something private and dark that neither of us knew how to address. We ate. The food was, as always, astonishing. Wild onion and dried fish, and something ground from seeds she'd shown us weeks earlier, thick and savory, and served with a flat bread that had a slight char from the stone and smelled of the earth itself. Hector finished his portion. He looked at Natty. He said, "Something's wrong." She looked at him. He said it again. Not louder. He never did the thing of repeating yourself louder, as if volume were a translation tool. He just said it again, quietly, with his eyes on hers. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said a word we'd heard before in her language, the one we'd associated with her daughter, and she made a gesture outward, toward the canyon's far passage, and then she brought her hand back to her chest and pressed it there, flat against her sternum. "Gone, daughter. Here in my chest, ache." Hector sat with that for a moment. I watched him decide something. You could see it happening, the internal argument, the weighing, the arrival at a conclusion. He put down his bowl, he looked at Natty directly, and he said, "I lost a son." She couldn't understand the words, but she was watching his face when he said it, and she was, I saw this clearly, reading it. Reading the information that didn't require translation. The set of his jaw, the way his eyes went to a different distance for a moment before coming back, the brief compression of his mouth. The language of having lost something. She said nothing, but she reached across the space between them and she put her hand briefly over his, just rested it there. One breath, two, and then she withdrew it and looked back at the fire. I did not write anything in my ledger that evening. Some things you just carry as they are. The trouble started in September. Pollitt, the rancher 3 miles west, had been circling this situation for a while. Hector's regular rides east hadn't gone entirely unnoticed, and Pollitt had his own interests in the canyon water, and he had opinions about what kinds of relationships were appropriate for a man in Hector's position to be maintaining. He came to the ranch house on a Wednesday morning with 2 of his hands, and a way of holding himself that was designed to read as casual, while communicating something else entirely. I was doing fence work near enough to hear most of it. Word is you've been making friends out in the canyon, Pollitt said. He had a mild voice, which I always found more worrying than a loud one. Hector looked at him. Just saying, Pollitt continued, that there are people in this territory who'd find that kind of thing interesting to know about. The land office, the agency. A threat plain as sunlight. Hector's jaw worked. His hand went to his forearm, the scarred one, and he pressed his thumb against the scar, which was the thing I'd noticed him do when he was containing something larger than usual. He said, "You done?" Pollitt smiled, just a friendly concern. "I know what it is," Hector said. "You done." Pollitt left. I found Hector at the water trough afterward, hands braced on either side, looking down at the water. His back was very still in the specific way of a man controlling his breathing. I came and stood beside him and didn't say anything. After a while he said, "He'll do it." I said, "Probably." He said, "She doesn't know. She doesn't know any of this is coming." I thought about that. About Natty and her canyon, her garden, her hanging herb bundles, her fire, her private grief, her extraordinary food that tasted like something being held onto against forces that wanted it gone. I said no. Hector straightened. He looked east, toward the canyon country, though you couldn't see it from here. Just sky and distance, and the particular kind of light that the late afternoon makes in New Mexico, golden and melancholy, and somehow permanent feeling even as it changes. He said, "I have to tell her." We rode out before dawn. Not the usual time, not the usual easy pace. Hector moved with a purpose that his horse could feel. She kept wanting to go faster than he asked, and he kept holding her back. Not because there was reason to be slow, but because he was, I think, working out something in his head that required the time. I kept quiet. My ledger was in my pocket and I kept my hand on it the way some men touch a cross or a worry stone, not to write anything, just to have it. The canyon was still in shadow when we arrived, the sun not yet high enough to reach down into it. The air cool and smelling of that particular morning smell that lives in rock country, mineral and dry and ancient, like the smell of time itself. Natty was already awake. She had her fire going. She was crouched beside it in that low, easy way she had, completely balanced, making something from cornmeal in a small flat pan. The sound of it, the quiet sizzle, the wooden spoon's rhythm, hit me somewhere unexpected. She looked up when she heard us and something crossed her face. Not surprise. Something closer to relief which troubled me because it meant she'd been waiting. Anticipating this visit in a way she didn't usually, which meant something in her had felt something shifting in the territory around her, and she'd been waiting to see what came toward her as a result. Sharp Natty, always. Hector dismounted slowly, hat off. He stood for a moment at the edge of her camp and looked at the fire and the pan and the smell of the morning cooking, and his face did the thing again, that movement, that recognition. And then he seemed to collect himself, and he came and sat down across from her in his usual place. I tied the horses and sat to the side, my place. She finished what she was doing at the fire and she handed portions to both of us without asking, just matter of fact. "You're here so you eat." And I thought about how many people in my life had ever fed me with that kind of ease, that lack of ceremony or performance. Just, here is food, eat it, this is what we do for each other. Not many, 3 maybe. My mother, an older hand named Jervis who'd been on the trail with me in '79, and now, improbably, a woman in a canyon in the New Mexico territory whose language I did not speak. Hector ate. Slowly. He was delaying something and she knew it. I could tell she knew it by the particular quality of her patience, which was different from her usual patience. More watchful. The food was, I want to record this properly, even now, the food was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The corn cakes were different from the last time, softer, with something wild green worked into them that she'd harvested from somewhere in the canyon, and the flavor of them was bright and complicated and entirely unlike anything in my experience of food. It tasted like the canyon smelled. That's the only way I can put it. Mineral and ancient and alive all at once. Hector set his empty pan down. He looked at her. She looked at him. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The fire made its sounds. Far up in the canyon, a bird called twice and went quiet. Then Hector reached into his shirt pocket and he drew out a piece of paper, folded small. He held it for a moment without opening it, looking at it. Then he looked up at her and he said, "A man is going to try to make trouble for you." She watched his face, doing the reading. "The land office," he continued slowly, spacing the words as he sometimes did when he was trying to give her time to catch the shape of it, even if not the words themselves. "Government men. They might come." He opened the paper. It was a map. I recognized it as something he'd drawn himself, rough but accurate. The ranch boundary, the canyon, a route marked in pencil. He held it out to her. She took it. She looked at it for a long time. She was not a woman who performed comprehension she didn't have. She took the actual time required, tracing the lines with one finger, her expression concentrated. Then she set it in her lap and looked at him. He said, "There's a place here," and leaned forward slightly and pointed at the mark he'd made, a small X in the canyon's northern passage. Water and cover, far enough that they wouldn't look. She looked at the map. She looked at him. I don't know what she said. The words were quiet and I don't have the language, but the tone of it, the tone was asking something. Not the logistics question, not the where or when. Something underneath those, something about why. "Why are you doing this?" That was the question in her voice. Hector was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I wrote down, word for word, as soon as I could get my ledger open. "Because you've been feeding people your whole life, and nobody ever thought to warn you when something was coming." He said it to the fire mostly, not performing it, just saying it like it was a fact he'd finally located and needed to get out into the air. The silence after that was its own kind of large. Natty looked at him for a long time with an expression I will not pretend to fully interpret. There was something in it that was recognition, the same kind I'd seen on his face when he first tasted her food, a kind of arriving, and underneath that, something older and more complicated that I had no right to name. She folded the map and held it in her hands. Then she said something to him. Several sentences, quiet and measured, her eyes on his face the whole time. He listened. He couldn't understand the words any more than I could, but he listened with his whole body, that particular stillness of his that was not passivity but attention, concentrated and complete. When she finished, he nodded, slowly, once. She stood. She went to her dwelling and came back a moment later with something in her hands, a small bundle, tied with cord. She held it out to him. He took it, he looked at it. It was the herbs, some of them, the ones she'd shown him, the ones he'd learned and written down in his cramped back-page notes, dried and bundled and given. He held them with both hands. She looked at him with that measuring look, and then she said something brief that I have turned over in my mind for years now, trying to find the edges of its meaning. Her tone when she said it was, I can only describe it as final, but not in the way of ending, in the way of settling, of something landing in its permanent place. Hector looked at her, and then he made the promise. Not in words exactly. He opened his hands, both of them, palms up, the bundle of herbs resting across them, and he bowed his head slightly. A gesture I'd never seen him make. Something old and serious that didn't belong to any tradition I recognized, but seemed to come from the same place as all the real gestures do. Below language, below custom, from wherever the actual self lives. She watched him. Then she nodded, once. That was it, that was the whole of it. I rode home that afternoon with the wind at my back and the low sun turning everything copper and bronze. and I was trying to understand what I'd witnessed, and finding that my ledger keeper's brain wasn't quite up to the job. What I had seen was two people, across every divide of language and culture and history and circumstance that the world had managed to erect between them, recognize each other. Not as the same, not pretending the differences away, but recognize something in each other that the differences hadn't touched. Hector rode beside me, and he wasn't doing his silence the usual way. He was just present, quiet in a different manner. Lighter, maybe, though that seems like the wrong word for a man of his particular density. I said eventually, because I could not, "What did you promise her?" He thought about it for a while. He said that I'd come back. I said, "That's it." He said, "That's enough." Pilot went to the land office in October. What happened after that was complicated and slow, and not the kind of thing that resolves cleanly or quickly. The territory in those years rarely did anything cleanly or quickly. There were men who came and roads they took and reports that were filed. But Nati was not where they looked when they looked. The map had done its work. And Hector kept riding east every week and sometimes twice. He brought what he could. He learned more words than me, slow accretion, a handful at a time, enough to begin to understand the shape of her sentences, if not always their content. She never cooked the same thing twice. Every visit was something new. Every bowl held something I hadn't tasted before, some combination I hadn't imagined, drawn from the land she had known her whole life. And every time he finished eating, he held his bowl in both hands for a moment before setting it down. I noticed, eventually, that she noticed him doing this, and that she watched him do it with an expression that was too quiet and too private for me to do anything with except write down and carry forward. I have one more entry from that year that I want to record here, from November 3rd, 1884. Hector brought her coffee today. She tried it, she made a face. He laughed, really laughed, not the usual half laugh, the actual thing. She looked at him laughing, and she said something, and he said, "I know," even though he probably didn't understand the words. She made the face again. He laughed again. She laughed too then, quiet to herself, but it was there. I don't know how to end this exactly. Life doesn't give you the clean last sentence, not usually. What I know is that Hector kept his promise. Every week, then every other, as the years changed around them both, and the territory kept reshaping itself, and the things that wanted to erase her kept trying. He kept showing up. And she kept cooking. And whatever passed between them in that canyon, across all that silence and all those inadequate words, and all those meals eaten beside a fire in the rock country of New Mexico, it held. Some things do. That's what I kept coming back to, all those years of riding east with him, all those pages of my ledger filling up with the small details of what I'd seen. Some things hold. Not because they're supposed to, not because the world makes it easy. Just because the people involved,